Friday, guys. Mrs. Lloyd and I got Penny with us here today. Gonna go over our notes for today. I posted in Plan Book this as a PDF. I'll also have it scanned on this PowerPoint we're about to watch, but the PDF version may be a whole lot easier to see and read. So if you haven't yet copied this stuff down, you might take a minute, pause the video, go to Plan Book, click on the link to the PDF, and copy this down. I did color code it intentionally. If you are one of those people that like color coding stuff, if not, doesn't matter. So we're going to talk about some more structures of the respiratory system and then a little bit more about their functions and their roles. So this is a picture of the packet I was just showing you. I want to go over a few things. If you pause the video to go copy all this down, there was one line I forgot to have you guys copy down. So add that now, right here, the pharyngotympanic tube. It's basically a mixture of the two words pharynx and tympany or tympanic. If you remember, tympanic membrane was in your ear. That's your eardrum. And so that is a little tube that goes from the back of your nose to your ear. So when we talk about popping your ears, right, plugging your nose and blowing out, that air that you're forcing through your ears is what helps pop your eardrum back out. So that's the little location of that. Some color-coded things in here I want to go over. First thing, let's talk about sinuses. Maybe you're at home with a little cold or something, and so you're feeling a little plugged up or stuffed up. Your sinuses, if you remember, are all found inside of your bones. So everything in green on here is a sinus. So you have a frontal sinus on the frontal bone. You have the ethmoid sinus on the ethmoid bone. You have the sphenoid sinus on the sphenoid bone. And there's also a maxillary sinus. Your maxilla is the bone right here. You have a sinus basically kind of underneath your eyes. Can't really see it in this view though. Sinuses are important for your respiratory system. One, they make your brain lighter, but also there's mucous membranes in there. And some people suffer from sinus infections. And that happens when bacteria gets in these spaces in the bone. But you can see them all pictured really well here. Okay, everything in blue on this is showing basically a passageway, so an empty tube that things can move through. So I'm going to run through them in order, some of which we went over yesterday. So the nasal cavity, okay, just the space once you inhale air through your nostrils is there. And then follow the little yellow arrows. That's the way oxygen would be flowing. Then it's going to move down into your nasopharynx. Okay, this portion right here, the nasopharynx is basically where your nasal cavity is meeting the pharynx, which is essentially our throat. Your oral cavity, okay, is right here, and it comes back and it joins up with the pharynx at the oropharynx, where the pharynx and the oral cavity meet up. And then just a little bit further down, when we get very close to our larynx, which isn't labeled on here, but it's this region right here, we have the laryngopharynx. If you continue to follow that oxygen path down, you get to the trachea, and that would eventually lead to the bronchi and the lungs. Also in pink here, if you notice, I've labeled the things in pink are structures found in each of these passageways. So let's go through these. The nasal cavity, inside our nasal cavity, there are these extra folds. They're called concha, and they're covered in mucus, and it actually gives more surface area inside of our nostrils. So when we are humidifying air and trying to moisten air and make it warmer, there's more surface area to get that job done. In the oral cavity, right here, you can see this is bone right here. That's the hard palate. Stick your tongue on the roof of your mouth and you feel that hard part, the top of your mouth, that's your hard palate. It's a little weird, but if you pull your tongue a little bit further backwards, you can feel this fleshy piece, but right there, and that's your soft palate. Okay, your soft palate. This structure right here, it's not labeled, but that's your tongue right there. Very muscular, kind of a big blob in the bottom of your jaw and your mandible there. Um, so those are the structures in your nasal cavity and your oral cavity. Moving back down a little bit more, okay, we get to this point right here where air needs to go forward and down into the trachea. But this passageway back here, my screen's covering it up some, is the esophagus. I put this in pencil because it's not part of the respiratory system. It's part of the digestive system. But if you've ever choked on food or gotten water down the wrong pipe before, your food is meant to travel down the esophagus, not down the trachea. So we have a really cool structure that is meant to help prevent that. That's your epiglottis. So in pink right here, you follow that line back, it's this little fleshy piece. There's an arrow on here, I highlighted in pink, that when we swallow, that action of swallowing, it closes the flap over the trachea entrance here so that food goes down the backside of the esophagus and not into your trachea to prevent choking. But if you laugh or exhaling at the same time you're trying to swallow, you've maybe gotten food down or water down the wrong tube before. That's because your epiglottis wasn't sure, are we swallowing or are we putting air in? And so it's a stimulated based on your swallowing action, but it opens up so you can breathe. So that's why you tend to choke if you're talking while you're eating or laughing or something like that. And then the last part is the vocal folds, which are a part of your voice box or larynx. So they're right here. It's this little structure. It just looks like a little divot. I'm going to show you some pictures of them a little bit more clear on another slide. Now, the vocal folds sort of make an opening and they close and open depending on how much, how you're talking. Deep voice, high voice, you're singing, you have all different kinds of controls of your vocal folds. The hole, so the space between my fingers here, that hole is called the glottis. Okay, so the vocal folds basically surround the glottis, and that's the hole that air passes through, and those vocal folds vibrate as you talk to make sound. The last little things on here are the tonsils. I wrote all of those in sort of this purplish color. You have lots of tonsils. We identified them in the last chapter just as a group, but there are differences. So the linguinal tonsil is at the very back of your tongue. So it'd be back of your mouth and down a little bit. The palatine tonsil is at the very end of your soft palate. The palatine bone, right, makes up the roof of your mouth. That hard palate is palatine bone. Palatine tonsil is at the very end of your soft palate back there. I've outlined each of the tonsils in that purple color so you could identify where they're at. And then the last one, a little bit higher up, is the pharyngeal tonsil. It's basically at the very top of your pharynx, right at that nasopharynx region, right at the back of that. All right. I think that covers everything on this page. So in your packet, this is going to be on page 2 for you to fill out. If you like color coding, you might color code this picture to match. Notice the area shaded in pink, light blue, and teal on there. This is all the pharynx. So we're looking at the nose and the mouth. Again, here's the tongue. You can see those tonsils here. This would be the hard palate, the soft palate, palatine tonsil at the end of the soft palate. That's the nasal concha, those folds inside your nasal cavity that moisten air. They're made out of bone and then covered with mucus. So 3 parts of our pharynx. As we've already labeled, the nasopharynx is the top portion. I like this picture because it shows you those different regions. She's snoring. I'm boring her. Hope I'm not boring you. The oropharynx is basically at the back of your mouth where your oral cavity and the pharynx meet. And then a little bit further down, right above your voice box, is the laryngopharynx. All three of these together make up the pharynx. So make sure and get that labeled in your packet. So our pharynx is kind of this in-between place where everything is merging. Oftentimes we refer to it as our throat. Hey, she's out. Hi. I want you to circle on your page this little section right here. So you can see this flap right here. That's the epiglottis. It's got cartilage on it that folds over when you swallow. This would be the esophagus. And then this is the trachea. The top part of my trachea is the larynx. And the larynx is got these cartilages surrounding it. So circle kind of those areas where the cartilage is. That's the larynx right there. And so your laryngopharynx is where the pharynx and larynx meet up as air passes through that way. If it's food, it would pass through your pharynx and go through your esophagus instead. All right. This is on the next page, page 3, I believe. No, excuse me, same page, page 2. So this is a view from the front. We just looked at it side view. Okay. Now we're going to look at basically your throat from the front. So your larynx, the voice box region, is where I have this bracket labeled. And then the trachea is that portion down. You can see the distinct cartilage rings there. Now when we talk about some other structures, the hyoid bone was something that we discussed in the skeletal system. It was that free-floating bone in your throat. It's got all these ligaments and cartilages attached to them that help make up your voice box. And then right above, we have the glottis, the epiglottis. And it is the little, you can see the flap, that's what's going to cover up the very top of my larynx and my trachea whenever I'm swallowing, but it will stay upright if you aren't swallowing. All right, and then the other parts that make up your throat, here's a lot of cartilage because we need this open all the time because we need to breathe all the time. So your thyroid cartilage is almost right underneath your thyroid gland, part of the larynx. Ladies have not as much of a pronounced larynx, but we talk about an Adam's apple. On males, their thyroid cartilage is much more distinct and larger. And so you can see that sort of poking up there. Cricoid cartilage is right underneath that. It kind of has this more of a U shape. That's the little cartilage underneath. And then the rings that hold the trachea open are called tracheal rings, and they are made up of hyaline cartilage. And if you remember, hyaline cartilage is the most common or abundant cartilage in our entire body. And so it's the one that's going to hold up the rest of the respiratory system when we get into the lungs and all the tubes in the lungs. It's also hyaline cartilage down there. You can even feel your trachea cartilage rings if you push, not too hard, and kind of rub your hand up and down on your trachea right here. You feel these little bumps, and that's your hyaline cartilage of your throat. I wanted to show you this picture. This is showing the vocal cords. So when I was talking about the epiglottis, this is the flap. The glottis is a hole. So this opening right here, that's the glottis. So it's not a structure, it's the hole that the vocal cords surround. So depending on when you are talking, you can tighten those vocal folds or loosen them up, and it changes your voice and your pitch and allows you to make different sounds. You music people probably know even more about this than I do. Your epiglottis is seen here up above this little fleshy piece. It's open in this view, but if the person were to swallow, it would close and cover up that hole that you see right there. Okay, same page, page 2, this picture. I'm not going to label everything on this picture because you don't need to know them. But if that bugs you, Okay, your textbook has most of these pictures in them. We're around page 816-ish, 816 in your book. If it bugs you that I'm not going to label everything. This is a view if we were taking your throat where your trach and your esophagus are, so probably right about here, cutting it and then holding it open. I really hope that we get to do our pig dissections at the end of the year, because this is something I have you do with the pigs so that you can see how the trachea and the esophagus look. You can see these two distinct holes. So the bottom of the screen is the anterior side, the top of the screen is the posterior side. So anterior is the front, posterior is the back, right? So the first hole you see there is the lumen of the trachea. Remember, lumen just means like space or hole or opening. Our lumen, lumella of our bones were like the spaces where our osteocytes lived in the bone. It just means hole, basically the little area they live in, or an empty space. So this is where air would be flowing in and out. Behind it, this more muscular piece right here is my esophagus. That's all smooth muscle surrounding it. When I swallow, my esophagus is squeezing my food down, and so that's muscular. Whereas the trachea lumen is held open by cartilage. So inside my trachea, we talked about mucous membranes, all my holes, we got mucous membranes in them. And so this is showing that inner layer of my trachea. It's a mucous membrane. So that's the mucosa layer. Notice the little hairs, the cilia. They're going to constantly be sweeping debris or gunk, right? Phlegm, maybe if you're coughing up gross stuff out of your lungs. It's going to be sweeping that stuff up into at least your larynx portion and the pharynx portion, and at that point you can cough and get something out of your mouth, either spitting it out or maybe blowing it out of your nose. We already mentioned hyaline cartilage. All that blue on there, that's the hyaline cartilage. Notice that it's a horseshoe shaped. Horseshoe shape is really important here because the esophagus sits right inside of that horseshoe. When you swallow, if that was cartilage all the way around as a total circle, if you ate a big piece of food and it was trying to move down your esophagus, you'd be really restricted. So the esophagus actually pushes into your trachea if you take a really big swallow of food. Mrs. Lloyd doesn't always chew her food super good. And I don't know if you guys have ever swallowed like a big chunk of food before, and it's like felt tight. You weren't choking, but you felt like a pressure in your throat, your trachea. That's because the food, you had your open cartilage, and as the food passed down, it was pushing into your trachea as it moved down. And then it passed as it slid down into your stomach. But because there is this no cartilage right here, the esophagus sort of pushes into the trachea with some food. Usually the esophagus is closed if food's not in it, and then the trachea can be wide open. But the trachea has to have cartilage because we need air all the time. Notice I didn't label the rest of them is because you're not going to need to know that for your test. And so if that really bugs you, you can find those labels in your textbook. All right, next page, page 3. Some of the membranes and other just general landmarks of our lungs. Okay, so on this picture, if you just to get ourselves acquainted, okay, we have the clavicles up here. Think of your clavicles as the top part of your lungs. Okay, that's essentially your lungs come all the way up to here. Your lungs are huge. They cover your whole chest. That's why the doctors listen to your breath sounds on your back, because you have better access actually to your lungs on the backside. This is going to be different than the heart. We learned about the base and the apex of the heart. It's flip-flopped for the lungs. So the apex basically means point. So the pointy part of my lungs is at the top. Okay. And so that top label there is the apex, the pointy piece of my lungs. I skipped over mediastinum. Mediastinum is that space the cavity of the heart lays in with the tubes and stuff coming out. We mentioned that the trachea and esophagus were part of the mediastinum. So that's just this general region in the middle. But what we're looking at here with the lungs is the pleural cavity. Pleural means lungs. That would be a prefix you see a lot in this chapter. So the apex is the pointy piece at the top, basically right at the clavicle region. And then the base is down below, sitting right on top of the diaphragm. So kind of almost the bottom of your rib cage region, that's where the base of the lungs are. They are big. They're very big. So your diaphragm muscle, super duper important for breathing. When we talk about how respiration occurs, diaphragm is crazy important for that. But I want you to know the nerve that stimulates your diaphragm. And it's an automatic thing if you're not thinking about breathing. If I tell you to hold your breath or take a deep breath, you can manually control that. But when you're unconsciously breathing, right, not intentionally, it's and all the time, really, it's controlled by the phrenic nerve, PH. That nerve is really important for knowing if someone's, if they're able to breathe or not. So when people get put on respirators, there might be an issue with the phrenic nerve in the nervous system. And that's why they need machines to breathe for them, is because of an issue with that nerve not controlling the diaphragm. It becomes problematic. Okay. And like every organ system, we have membranes that line them. And remember that this is an internal organ. So it's going to have a serous membrane and serous fluid, and it's going to have double layers. Okay. Think of that plastic bag. Okay. Part of the plastic bag touches the actual organ, and some of it lines the wall of the body. If I were you at home, I might take a little highlighter and highlight these two different lines right here, maybe different colors, so you could tell them apart from each other. So draw one line going to the inner layer. That's the one that would be touching the lungs themselves, would be directly on top of the lungs, and that's the visceral pleura. It's a type of serous membrane, but because it's touching an organ, it's visceral. So the visceral pleura is our prefix for lungs. And then if it's lining the cavity of the body, it is called, not visceral, but parietal pleura. Good. And then there's a space between them. So we just call that space the pleural cavity. And in that cavity, we'd have serous fluid that's lubricating. So as you're breathing in and out all day long, those two membranes aren't rubbing against each other and creating harmful friction. I know I might be going too fast for you to write some things down. You guys have access to this PowerPoint in Google Classroom. All right. So yesterday we went through the upper respiratory tract. Okay. And then now we're going to go into the lower respiratory tract. So air comes down the trachea, it branches into your right and left bronchi. And then from there, it starts going into smaller and smaller passages. Once we reach the end, the terminal end, we get to smaller and smaller bronchioles. Bronchioles is just basically means a tiny bronchi. On this picture, notice it's surrounded by smooth muscle. This is what allows for constriction or relaxation of your airways. We don't love it when our airway is constricted. This sometimes happens in an inflammatory response. Somebody has allergies, and they might need an inhaler because their passageways are getting constricted. That's the smooth muscle right there in the terminal bronchioles, tiny bronchi. This is at the end point. Okay, that air is traveling to and through the very end. So the terminal bronchioles branch off into these smaller regions called the respiratory bronchioles. And that's basically the last tube that air is going to pass through before it gets to these little clusters. So the alveolar ducts are the passageways heading to the alveoli. It's just an even smaller passageway. There's no smooth muscle on the alveolar ducts. And then we get to the sac, the alveolar sac. The alveolar sac is referring to a group of alveoli. alveoli are the site of gas exchange. The sac is more described as like a cluster of grapes. Like imagine grapes on the end of a stem. That stem would be the alveolar duct, and a bunch of grapes would be the alveolar sac. One grape, an alveoli. Alveoli is singular. Alveolar is plural in this case. Okay, getting to the end here, guys. So go ahead and flip back to that page from yesterday, the page 9. We filled out the top part in green on the conduction zone, and now we're going to go to the respiratory zone and those structures that I just went over. Just like yesterday, this was going from the passageway of air going down the list. The same is true for what we're going to go today. So if you were trying to track how air is flowing through, you'd start up here with the nasal cavity, work your way all the way down till we get to this last little A here at the end. So this is called the respiratory zone because this is actually where gas exchange happens. The conducting zone was how we get air into the actual place where we do the gas exchange piece of it. So all of these structures are considered part of gas exchange. So we start off, as we just saw in the other picture, the respiratory bronchiole. And it's basically a bronchiole that has alveoli attached to it. And so they get the name respiratory because this is the site of gas exchange. They're the last stop passageway basically for air. We didn't define this yesterday, so I want to define bronchioles. Bronchioles are tiny conducting passageways. So the bronchi are the largest, and then they divide and divide and divide till we finally get to tiny bronchi, which are our smallest connecting passageways. That's just a bronchiole in general. Respiratory bronchiole has alveoli. The alveolar duct, this is, like I showed you, essentially the passageway, and it has smooth muscle ringing it all around it. It's got smooth muscle. This is going to be able to constrict and relax, letting more air in or out. Hopefully more air in, but sometimes our body shuts that off and then we have shortness of breath. We can't get big, deep breaths. Asthma, that's what happens oftentimes with asthma. We keep going down that tube into smaller and smaller pieces. The alveolar sacs, that is described as basically a bunch of grapes. Respiration doesn't happen exactly in the sac because it's a bunch of them, but the end part, the alveoli or alveolus, is plural there, singular. Alveolus would be one. Alveoli is different alveoluses. That's not a real word, but this is a single individual grape, a single sac. And the function of this whole respiratory zone, as I said, is gas exchange. But of all of these structures we just listed, the only one that does gas exchange is the alveolus. So draw a little line from gas exchange to the alveoli, alveolus, and that's actually where the action happens. And we'll talk about how that happens next time. I hope you guys are doing well. Message me on Remind. You can email me if you have any questions. And this has been a really weird week. And I hope you got more out of it than Benny did. Nice to see you guys.